Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation on butterfly biology in Nebraska prairies, Monarchs and Regal Fritillaries. My name is Laura, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras are off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during the presentation. We will have a very brief survey following the presentation that should only take less than a minute to complete. The survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Ted Burk, Professor of Biology at Creighton University, who is an author of several books and papers about insect conservation and biology. We're excited to have Ted here to talk about these butterfly royalties, so let's get started, and Ted, you can take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you everyone who's watching on Zoom, and thank you very much to Conservation Nebraska for the invitation. People don't appreciate, I think, in generally what an interesting state Nebraska is biologically. This is, of course, a map of the native vegetation in Nebraska. So we've got everything from Ozark-type deciduous forests in the southeast to pine forests, western pine forests in the northwest. We've got all kinds of grasslands in between. I say that to my students that we're at the southern edge of northern things, the northern edge of southern things, the eastern edge of western things, the western edge of eastern things, and we have our own things. And then, as you can see, we have three rivers that run this length of the state. The length of the state from west to east, the Niobrara, the Platte, and the Republican, and so that again provides more habitat and also invasion corridors for things to come through that maybe wouldn't. So it's actually biologically, and of course we have tremendous elevational gradient from about 1,000 feet above sea level here to a mile above sea level, in western Nebraska, and so it's just a really, really interesting state biologically. And as part of that, it has a very high diversity of butterflies. We have over 200 species of butterflies in the state. Now, we have different butterflies in different parts of the state. So in our area, there's probably about 70 that you could hope to see if you put in a kind of a diligent effort. In other parts of the state, you have different ones. And so this book just came out this year. Steve Spomer at UNL has been working on butterflies for decades and been working on this book for years, and it's really going to be the definitive book. But again, we are one of the top 10 states in the country in terms of number of butterfly species, which maybe people wouldn't have guessed. And even reflects what we were talking about here on his cover. On his cover, he's got a butterfly from the east, a butterfly from the west, and a couple of butterflies from the middle on the cover of his book. So tonight we're going to talk about just two of those, but they are two that probably the public has the greatest interest in terms of conservation. And I call them royal butterflies because of their names. There's the Regal Fritillary, and also, of course, the famous monarch butterfly. And so the Regal Fritillaries by area Idalia shown there. It's a large orange butterfly, but like many of the fritillaries on the underside, they're bright silver spots, so they're quite striking. And then, of course, the monarch is very familiar to people. So let's talk about the Regals first. Regals have a very unusual life history. So at this time of the year, all the Regal Fritillaries are small caterpillars down in the grasslands and the prairies. Their host plants are violets. And so they're busy growing, going through 6 different stages as a caterpillar. And then eventually, of course, they will form a pupa sometime, probably May, something like that. And then we see the adults flying in big numbers. The males come out first and they fly around frantically, all looking for mates. and all the males try to be out before any of the females, so they all have a crack at each of the females. The females come out a little bit later, maybe more toward the end of July, whereas the males are really out between maybe the middle of June and the middle of July. So if you want to see them, that's the best time to go looking, at a place where there are good populations is, I say July 4th, plus or minus 2 weeks. So they mate, and then the males all die off. So by the end of the summer, you hardly ever see the males flying around. The females are much less conspicuous because they fly down close to the ground and they're not nearly so obvious. They're out there, but they're not seen as much as the males when they're flying around frantically. But they mate, and then they do another weird thing, which is they actually, having mated, they don't immediately lay eggs. They hold off for a month or so before they start laying their eggs, which always seemed to me like a bad strategy. The longer you wait to reproduce after you've mated, just the more chance that something might get you in the meantime. But anyway, after they do that, then they do another weird thing, which is unlike most butterflies, which put the eggs on the caterpillar plant. So you'll see monarchs always laying their eggs on a milkweed. They just scatter them in the prairie, presumably in areas where there are some violets. But the poor caterpillar has to hatch and then crawl around to find a violet. But once it's found a violet, it doesn't then chow down then, but it goes into a hibernation-like state for 5 or 6 months, overwintering down in the litter at the base of the prairie or something like that, before finally, around this time of the year, they break that diapause and they start feeding and complete the cycle. So it's a very, very unusual life cycle, and there seem to be several counterintuitive things about it. But nevertheless, they were, at one point at least, very common butterfly throughout much of the northeastern part of the country. So this shows you how things have gone. So this is a map from the Fish and Wildlife Service. The blue counties are where they are present now. The orange counties are where they were historically. So they used to be found in tallgrass prairies, grasslands, all the way from the Rockies to the Atlantic, and from the kind of the middle latitudes all the way up into the southern parts of Canada. But as you can see, from the majority of the original range, they have been extirpated, which is the term you use for extinct in a particular area. And so east of the Mississippi, there's only a couple populations left. One of them, it's not really shown there, surprisingly. It's in Pennsylvania. It's on an Army artillery range. And so nobody tried to farm it, obviously. And so the butterflies survived. But we are kind of their last stronghold here in this part of the country. So Eastern Nebraska and Kansas, Western Iowa and Missouri is kind of the remaining heartland. So on the right then, it has the conservation status of the butterflies in different states. And so I've kind of put in red dots there the kind of the locally relevant ones. So in Iowa, they're considered imperiled. In Missouri, Nebraska, and South Dakota, they're considered the next step down in terms of risk. They're considered vulnerable. Only down in Kansas are they considered not of immediate conservation concern. But they are on the list of endangered or threatened species that are of interest to conservation biologists in something like 15 different states. So they've really fallen on. I'm looking for my laser pointer, which I seem to have. There we go. Anyway, so they are a species that's been eliminated from probably 80% of its original range. And so they're a big and bright and conspicuous butterfly, and really kind of representative of especially the prairie regions. And so it's something that is therefore of really high conservation interest. So why have they declined? Well, this one's pretty simple. When we talk about monarchs, there are quite a lot of reasons that monarch populations have been declining. But for regals, they are a tallgrass prairie specialist. They are very intolerant of any other kind of habitat. They often are even unwilling to cross a road to get from one patch of prairie to another. So they're just very, very finicky, but it has to be a high quality prairie. And so what this map shows you, everything that's green there is natural habitat that is now row crop agriculture. And so you can sort of see, if you kind of see where they used to live and you look at grasslands that have been converted to row crop agriculture, you can sort of understand why they have become so much less widespread than they used to be. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we do on butterflies. I don't want to get into that in a big way. We want to talk more about the butterflies in general. But you know, I will present a little bit of data here and there where it's kind of relevant to the Regals and the Monarchs. So what we've done for 25 years now is we've done surveys of butterfly populations and their flower use at 4 different prairies here in Eastern Nebraska. The main site, which is on the next slide, is Glacier Creek Preserve out in northwest Omaha. But we also did 15 years of, I guess, 20 years of work at Bowermeister Prairie down in Lake Zorinsky, southwest Omaha. And then we did 10 years of surveys at 9 Mile Prairie near the airport in Lincoln, and Spring Creek Prairie in Denton is the Audubon Society state headquarters there in Denton, southwest of Lincoln. And so overall, you know, what we do is something called a Pollard transect. It's a rather simplistic technique that was invented by a guy named Ernie Pollard for surveys of butterflies in Britain. You just lay out a standard path that tries to go through all the different habitats, so usually 2 kilometers long or so, and you just walk that same path week after week, month after month, year after year. So we did this, doing these surveys for 25 years, and we did it for 20 weeks a year, starting the 1st of June and going to the middle of October. So I've walked some of those darn paths, the same exact path 500 times now at a place like Glacier Creek Preserve. But what we do then is we count every butterfly we see within 5 meters either side. And we also then record within that same 5 meter any butterfly that we see visiting a flower. So altogether, we've seen getting close to 100,000 species, 100,000 individual butterflies that we've recorded of about 60 different species. So there are still a few that we kind of would like to see. There's, you know, even one that I saw flying over the crossroads one day that, you know, we haven't seen at the prairie. And we've recorded over 20,000 butterfly flower visits, which is the 2nd largest number ever. Unfortunately, there was a guy out in Colorado that got 40,000, so we're not going to catch him. But anyway, so this is kind of what it looks like. We just kind of walk through the standard path through the prairie and count butterflies and see what they're on. This is one of the first students to get involved in this, Mary Canella, and she's an immigration lawyer in town now, having gone from Creighton to law school. So, as I said, we've done work at 4 different sites, but I don't want to trouble you with all that. This is the main site, and it accounts for, you know, more than half of all our work. And this is All-Line Prairie, is what it used to be called. It's the original quarter section, half-mile by half-mile area out in northwest Omaha. That was, you know, the All-Line Farm, All-Line Family Farm, and they gave it to the University of Nebraska. And it was restored from cropland to tallgrass prairie. The original restoration was in the 1970s. Tom Bragg here, Dr. Bragg here at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, has been in charge from the very beginning and still is. And it's just a wonderful job of restoring. It's as, you know, it's as close to the real original thing as it could possibly be for restoration. And so, how many of you have ever been out to Glacier Creek? Oh, good, I'm talking to the choir here. But it's definitely, if you want to see what a real high quality prairie restoration looks like, you should go out to Glacier Creek. And, you know, it's open from, you know, dawn to sunset every day. And there are some trails marked out that can follow. So you can sort of see the vestige of the original farm with the terracing and things like that. But and of course, it's now been expanded. They've gotten the properties on 3 sides in addition to the original All-Line Prairie. So the greater Glacier Creek Preserve now is about 400 acres, whereas the original All-Line Prairie was, you know, the classic 160, you know, acre, you know, quarter section that you all read about in 8th grade, you know, class. Again, they have 3 major prairie units out there, and we'll talk about, you know, fire and fire management in prairies a little bit later. So they burn 1/3 of the prairie areas each year. So another way to say it is each area out there gets burned once every 3 years. So you can see kind of there's a small west unit, a larger south unit, larger north unit, and that are treated separately. But you can also see there are woods, there's a wetland area, there are mowed paths, so some real short grass areas and so forth. So there are a variety of different habitats out there. And so we also record, what habitat, where along the transect the butterflies are as we see them. So, yeah. I was going to say to everybody, all you folks listening online, if you haven't been out there, you really ought to go there. It's something that's a really special place, and surprisingly few people know about it. And they would definitely like to, have more use. If nothing else, it keeps them in good terms with the university in terms of funding and support. So just from our studies, again, this is just for the period from 98 to 2022. This is the total number that we counted in a given summer, on our 20 counts altogether. And so you can see there were as few some years as 40. And there were other years where we saw as many as 400. So it's up and down, but there's no particular trend. No decline. There's just up and down according to the weather, according to which area got burned, and they have to recolonize from the other areas.
Is some of that predator swamping as well?
Well, that's probably part of that. I've never actually seen predation on them. I'm sure it happens. Most of the predation on these things occurs on the eggs and the caterpillars. And these guys, mainly the caterpillars. In the adults, again, the males are so desperate to seek out mates that they'll chase anything that flies around there, including like other butterflies. But I've seen these guys chasing barn swallows, which seems to me like a really bad idea for a bird. Anyway, so again, for everyone that we count, we kind of calibrated that in a way that I don't need to get into. But for everyone that we count on the counts, we think there's about 3 or 4 actually out there. So in some years, there's probably been as many as 1,500. In other years, when it's lower like this, there may be only a few hundred. But you can sort of see there's a long-term average of something like 500 or 600 out there. So and again, this has been maintained, not just for the 25 years we've been looking at them, but for the 25 years before that, and so on. So that we can conclude overall that there's a kind of a stable, healthy population that fluctuates up and down, like all populations do, but it's not, declining. What they're doing out there is working in terms of supporting, the population of this, butterfly of interest. So this is when you see them. So again, along the bottom, it's the number of weeks of the 20 in the surveys. So this would be the first week of June, and this would be the middle of October. So again, when I said, July 4th plus or minus 2 weeks, that's kind of what you see here as we go, into the middle of June, and suddenly we see lots of them flying around for a few weeks, and then, the males are all gone, and we see very few after that. A few females get spotted, from time to time. But again, if you want to go and see them, the time to do it is like I say, in that window from about the middle of June to the middle of July. You'll see lots of them flying around all over the place. And there are good populations of them at Glacier Creek. There are also good populations of them at 9 Mile Prairie, and also good populations of them at Spring Creek Prairie. So there are a number of places around here where you can go and see them, and other places I'm sure as well. Those are just the ones that I know have really good healthy populations. We have people sometimes come from all over the country, that have heard about this species and how it's in danger and so forth, and come here specifically to go to places where they can see them. Again, they're prairie specialists. So even out at the prairie, when we record where we found them, you can see that something like 80% of them were out flying around over the prairie areas. This was a new restoration. The original restoration was done in the 1970s. And it was pretty simplistic in those days. They just kind of, drilled in 4 species of prairie grass and let everything else come in on its own, which it eventually did. But the technology is tremendously different now. You can put in like 100 species seed mixes and add water and get instant prairie. So they tore out the old farm ponds, and restored the natural topography and did a new restoration in 2022, kind of a smaller area. But anyway, between the prairie areas and then, you'll see some of them flying over. The mowed strips are maybe 5 yards wide. So you'll see them flying over the mowed paths to get to the other side. They won't fly over concrete, but they'll fly over, grass. But anyway, we've never seen one in the woods, ever. And the number that we've seen in 25 years, even flying over the wetland, is very small. So they are incredibly finicky about demanding that it would be a prairie. As part of one study that I did out there, we were watching to see how many of them would fly from one area to another, crossing the entrance road, which at that time was paved, it's gravel now. But 85% of them, when they come flying from the prairie and they see that gravel underneath them, which is only like 5 yards wide or something, they would turn around and go back. They wouldn't even cross the gravel to get from one prairie area to another. So very, very finicky, which is probably part of their problem. Once they're gone from a place, it's probably a long shot for them to come in from somewhere else and get back. They're not very good at dispersing. We see what flowers the different species go to, and this is what we've seen Regal Fritillaries on. And so you can see number 1 is good old common milkweed. Number 2 is wild bergamot, our native monarda. If you look at this, you'll see that 3 of the top 6 are milkweeds. So again, we think of milkweeds for monarch caterpillars, but they're also highly favored nectar plants for a wide variety of pollinators, including Regal Fritillaries. The most important, we'll see this more with the monarchs, by far the most important nectar plant for pollinators in our part of the world is this thing, tall thistle. Our native thistles are really critical for pollinators around here. So one of the things, hopefully, if you don't already know, is how to tell the difference between a native thistle, which we should encourage as much as we can, and the alien invasive thistles that we are required by law to get rid of. And it's actually I'll just say right now, it's very easy in our part of the world. The aliens they come out early, they're very prickly, and if you turn the leaf over, it's kind of shiny and green. If you take the natives, they flower later, maybe August instead of June or whatever. They're somewhat prickly, they are thistles, but they're not nearly as prickly as some of the aliens. But if you turn their leaf over, it'll be kind of fuzzy and white. And that works 100% of the time here. So, it's really easy once you know how to look for them to tell the natives that we should encourage as much as possible from the aliens that you are required by law to get rid of. Anyway, so that's kind of what the Regals go to out of the prairie. Most of these things are things that you could obtain from a native prairie nursery or something like that, and you could have in your garden. More on that kind of thing later. One of the things that's really critical for species like Regals that are really dependent on prairies is you have to keep it a prairie. And in our part of the world, we get about 30 inches of rain a year, which is exactly the boundary between a deciduous forest and a tallgrass prairie. And it can be tipped either way by human activity. The Native Americans, they wanted the grass for elk and bison and things, so they spread fires, to get rid of the woody vegetation. Then Europeans came in and created Arbor Day and planted trees everywhere. And so, humans have been messing with this part of the world for 10,000 years. The thing is that, what would have originally kept the system in more balance is gone now in terms of, this year has been a bad year to say what I'm about to say, which is the big sweeping wildfires don't occur anymore, although I guess they did out in the Sandhills this year. And also we've eliminated the big grazers, which also would browse down and keep some of the woody plants under control. So in our part of the world, if you don't do something, like mowing or even better burning, within just a few years, it isn't a prairie anymore. It gets rapidly invaded by sumacs and dogwoods. And then once they get established, the trees start to come in, the mulberries and ash and things like that. And within 10 years, it doesn't look anything like a prairie. And so the Regals, just won't stay there. And so you have to use fire management in our part of the world to keep a prairie a prairie. Now, the thing is, when you do a controlled burn, they usually do the burns here right about now out at Glacier Creek. It's mid-spring, and the timing is such that they want to prevent dominance by, you want to eliminate some of the alien kind of cold season grasses, kind of favor the natives, but they also, don't want the natives like the big blue stem to eventually kind of take over and, dominate all the wildflowers and things too. So again, this like burn any area every 3 years, burn 1/3 every year seems to work really well. But when you do a burn, especially if you think about this time of year, the Regals are all caterpillars down on leaf litter. It's going to kill them all in the area that you burn. But the idea is if you don't burn too much too often, they can recolonize from the unburned areas, kind of play hopscotch from place to place throughout the prairie and maintain that stable population. And it seems to be working very well out at Glacier Creek. But again, if you don't do the burning, people don't like to see the smoke and they don't like to think of the animals. The birds fly away, the mammals burrowed underground, the growth core of the plant is underground anyway, so it comes right back up, even better than ever because of the nutrients that are released in the ash of the fire and so forth. But it's going to get most of the insects in that area. But again, the idea is that they will recolonize from the other unburned areas. And this is what happens if you don't. The city of Omaha allegedly manages Bowermeister Prairie out of Lake Zerinsky. And they did have regular kind of burn schedules that they did for years and years when I first was doing these studies. And it was the most beautiful little pocket prairie that you can imagine. 30 acres on the shore, the south shore there of Lake Zerinsky. And then my theory is that the guy who cared and was in charge of it retired. And nobody took it over. So, about 2010 or so, they just quit doing anything except occasionally coming in there and mowing the sumac and stuff, which of course just stimulates it to grow back even faster. So this is that same area in 2016 compared to what it looked like 15 years earlier. Most of what you see there is sumac. So this is what happens in our part of the world if you don't take steps to keep it a prairie. The woody plants invade very, very quickly. So this is the Regals at Bowermeister. So when we first started doing the studies and they were doing kind of the regular burn rotations, it was small. It's a small prairie, 30 prairie remnant, never plowed, true prairie remnant is the Bowermeister family hay meadow. And so, we had a population that we count every year, let's say 30 or 40, which probably meant there were probably 100 or so. It's a small population. Those populations are always at some sort of vulnerability. But then you can see when they stop doing the burn management, you're not there now. They're gone. And so that's kind of what happens if you don't keep the prairie a prairie. Even a beautiful little kind of prairie like Bowermeister was. So this is just from one area out at Glacier Creek, to show you how the burns work. So these are the different years all kind of scrunched together there. But the red dot represents the year that they did a burn. And so this is just the number of Regals in the total population from one particular area. So you can see every time that they did a burn, there were far fewer Regals in that part of the prairie. But look, every time after they did a burn, they came back within a year or two to be just as good as they were before. So they do recolonize from the unburned areas, and it works. Looking at all the different prairies where we kind of looked at the burning, 18 out of 18 times that they did a burn, there were fewer Regals there that year. Not surprising. But then look, the first year after, the second year after, the Regals in the area went up. So again, it's kind of knock them down and then they come back again and kind of, rinse and repeat for decades, and you keep a healthy population of Regals. So how can you help Regals? Well, the thing is that they are so dependent upon tallgrass prairies that they're not like monarchs. There's not a whole lot you can do in your backyard to help Regals. Nobody's going to be able to have, a decent sized prairie in their backyard. So what you have to do is support the efforts to maintain prairies and to maintain Regals. So there are some citizen science things that one can do. The North American Butterfly Association has July 4th butterfly counts. They don't all happen on July the 4th. It's within a month or so. They're patterned after the Audubon Society's Christmas bird counts. So people go out and have a nice day, contributing to citizen science and kind of having a nice educational outing. Families and kids are welcome and so forth. And we go to different areas and we just count the butterflies and turn it in. Hundreds of these take place around the country. It gets turned into the North American Butterfly Association, and it's now, this has been going on for 30, 40 years. And so there's now an enormously big database on butterfly populations and how they're doing. That data has been used now in lots of scientific papers. So we do one every July out at Hitchcock Nature Center and some associated areas like Neil Woods and so forth. And I do one with some folks down at Pioneers Park in Lincoln. So there are opportunities to get involved in some of these. And then the Nebraska Evening Parks has a survey program for Monarchs and Regals. You can sign up to kind of take a particular location and do kind of some standard sort of counts there to help kind of see how population is going. And talk to me about that. They, like out at Allwine, they do it in the wrong place at the wrong time of the year. So they've got a mistaken impression about how few Regals there are. I could tell them this is where you should do it and this is when you should do it, and they'd see a lot more Regal. Anyway. But again, support organizations that are involved in prairie conservation, Conservation Nebraska, the Xerces Society, which is the International Society for the Conservation of Invertebrates. They work with pollinators. They're probably the top organization working with pollinators, but they also do fireflies and dragonflies and other things too. So if you're really interested in this kind of thing, you ought to belong to the Xerces Society. And they have a tremendous amount of materials, like $35 a year or something. We have local people here, for the Xerces Society. Nature Conservancy, of course, does a lot of land management out in central Nebraska. Then, of course, Glacier Creek Reserve is, it can be supported by private individuals as well as the university. And Spring Creek Prairie Audubon Center are kinds of places one could help support and help maintain these regal populations. Okay, let's turn to monarchs. So this is a diagram of the life cycle of monarch butterfly. We have 4 generations a year in our part of the world. This shows that the ones that went to Mexico and got there, they're there from like November until February or early March. And then they mate and they start their way back. Most of the males don't come back very far. It's the females that are mated that come back and reconstitute the population farther north. Again, I mentioned earlier, it's unusual this year that so many of them went to Mexico are actually coming so far back. Normally what happens is 99% of them don't come back to our part of the world. They stop and breed in Texas. And one of the really critical factors for monarch populations is what's the spring weather in Texas like? Because that's where you start the whole cycle, with the new population, the first generation of the year. We normally see them arriving. They then colonize all of Eastern North America. And so we see them, that first generation offspring, usually around Memorial Day. And then we make, in that breeding range all across North America, they make generation 2, which are out and flying around July the 4th. And then they make generation 3, which is out and flying about the 1st of August. And then they make generation 4, which are the ones that go back to Mexico. So the ones that go to Mexico in one year are the great grandchildren of the ones that did it the year before. And they all do it individually. There's nobody to follow, nobody to learn it from. It's all instinctive and pre-programmed. There's no other phenomenon like that in the world, that compares to the migration of the northeastern North American monarch. So of course they lay their eggs on milkweeds, and usually individually, one egg on either side of a leaf. They turn into this beautiful caterpillar, and then eventually this even more beautiful pupa before then becoming an adult. And caterpillars of moths and butterflies eat more of the Earth's green stuff than any other group of animals on Earth. Even including kind of things like antelopes and bison and things. They are the dominant herbivores of the Earth, the caterpillars of Lepidoptera. Now there's 10 times as many moths as there are butterflies, so moths, should get most of the credit. But these things grow in this, of course, they're cold-blooded, so their development is keyed into the temperature. The warmer it is, the faster they grow. And so in the summer, when it's nice and warm, they can go from egg to pupa in 10 days. And during that period, they'll go through 5 molts, and they will increase their weight by a factor of 3,000. Caterpillars are just gluttonous eating machines. So I tried to come up with some image to kind of make this even more memorable. So I said, okay, let's take an average size human baby. And I kind of looked, what's an animal out there that's 3,000 times the size of a human baby? And it turned out to be a killer whale. So imagine, this is how much they eat and how fast they grow. In 10 days, they can grow from the size of a baby to the size of a killer whale. Yeah, but again, 90% of them don't make it, to adults. There's a lot of predation by ants and ladybugs and things on the eggs. There's a lot of predation on the very small caterpillars. And so it's just kind of part of that circle of life thing that naturally, no more than 20% and usually less than that, actually make it to be an adult, to carry on the next generation. So this just kind of shows you that in kind of a little different way. So again, they overwinter down in Mexico, all the ones east of the Rockies. And so, in our part of the world, it's generation 4 that goes down to Mexico. In some places farther north, you only get in 3. Some places farther south, they can get in 5. But, through most of the range, it's 4 generations a year. So the first generation comes back, stops and breeds in Texas. And then they fan out and recolonize the whole area. And then in that breeding area, then we make generation 2 and generation 3 and generation 4 to go back to Mexico that year. Again, there's a much smaller population, and indeed it's getting tragically, dramatically small. West of the Rocky Mountains, that goes not to just a few areas in a very concentrated area down in the mountains of Mexico, but it goes, to 100 or so smaller aggregations along the coast of California, and we'll see that they're in real trouble there, compared even to the ones that go to Mexico. This is where they go in Mexico, so I can't really see the map very well, but here's kind of the general area. But there's Mexico City, and so they're 10,000 feet up in the mountains, in an Oyamel fir forest, They go there. It's hot. It's in the tropics, but it's high up. So it's usually cold, but hopefully not freezing cold. And so, again, being cold-blooded, it kind of more or less imposes a sort of a hibernation on them. They can be there for months without burning through a lot of stored, energy and so forth. Again, in the intact forest, they're protected from the wind and the rain and so forth. So it's a very particular place that they go to, with a very particular set of environmental conditions to allow them to get. Monarchs are a kind of a butterfly called a milkweed butterfly. There are hundreds of species around the world, but they're all tropical. And this is the only one of them that's moved up into the temperate zone. But coming from that heritage, they can't take a temperate comes winter. So they have to, get away from that temperate zone winter, and this is kind of what they do in Eastern North America. There are other monarch populations in the Caribbean, and South America and so forth that don't migrate. The conditions are favorable year-round. So this migratory phenomenon, which is so special and unique, is only typical of the ones that we have here in Eastern North America. And then you can see, so there are various different locations where one year or another they will aggregate. These are the two main ones here. The numbers there, even in a bad year, are pretty astounding. This is kind of what it looks like. This was the native people, of course, have known about this for thousands of years, but Western science didn't discover where they went until the 1970s. And so this was the first article in National Geographic, announcing that they'd found where they went. But this is what it looks like. This is a fir tree that looks orange because it's covered with monarch butterflies. And on a warm day, they kind of fly around a little bit. But if you have like a drone flying over, there'll be kind of the green forest, and then there'll be this little patch of orange kind of in the middle of the forest, which has got millions of butterflies in it. The density, you couldn't possibly count them all. So what they do is they measure a certain area and say, okay, there's so many per square meter or whatever, and then they just measure the size of the forest that they're covering. And it's amazingly small. There's about 25 million per hectare. If you like to think in terms of acres, there's 2.5 acres in a hectare. So 10 million per acre in these aggregations. Incredibly densely crowded. So what they do then every year, once they've kind of broken up and headed back, they kind of release the information about how many were there that winter, but it's released in terms of the number of hectares, the number of acres of forest covered. And it's incredibly small. So these are the numbers for the last 30 years or so. And so in the highest year ever since they started recording, which is the winter of 96 and 97, there were over 500 million of them. The lowest year ever was after that severe drought that we had in 2012. You guys probably remember that very severe drought. And so not many of them made it to Mexico. That's 0.67 hectares. So what's that, 2 acres? That's everybody from the Gulf to Canada, from the Rockies to the Atlantic in an area of 2 acres. Okay? It's up and down. There was a kind of an old average, and now there's kind of a new, unfortunately, lower average. They're up and down. A lot of that is dependent on the weather and so forth and so on. But it had the second lowest ever, in the winter of 23-24. And then it's come back a little bit these last 2 years. So this last winter, they covered 2.93 hectares. So that would translate to about 70 million butterflies, which is a lot of butterflies, but 70 million compared to 500 million is it's an 85 to 90% reduction. So that's 7 acres. And just to kind of put that in context, I couldn't find anywhere on the web how big UNO's campus is. And I looked for UNL. I even said, like, how big is Memorial Stadium? They just kept telling me it seats 80,000 people. But anyway, so I had to go to Creighton. Creighton's campus is 57 hectares or 140 acres. So all of those butterflies from the Gulf to Canada, from the Rockies to the Atlantic, fit in an area that's, 5% of the size of Creighton's campus. It's incredibly focused. And that, of course, is a problem because, there used to be, billions of passenger pigeons too, but they all hung out together and that was bad news. It's been a good year so far. Again, there's this website or this organization called Journey North. I don't know how many of you know about Journey North, where people can report, their first sighting of migrating birds or whatever. And so people report their first sighting of monarch butterflies. So this was last year, and this is this year. So they survived really well. They're coming back in big numbers. And again, a lot of them are coming much farther back before they stop to breed. In fact, it's kind of a problem. We're just barely at the place where milkweeds are coming up. So a lot of them may have actually got here before there was any milkweeds to lay their eggs on. But anyway, you can just see from the dots here that by the end of April, there's a lot more of them, a lot farther along than in a typical year. So that's good. We're off to a really good start, and hopefully it'll continue for the next 3 generations. The traditional way that people followed the migration was by tagging. This was pioneered by a guy at the University of Toronto, and he had little tags that he handmade and glued them on. And that's actually how they found where they went. You don't recover many of these, but every once in a while you recover one. You kind of connect the dots, and they're all pointing as if they were going to a location in Mexico. Now there's a very big organization of the tags. It's run by Monarch Watch down at the University of Kansas. So you get these tags that you put on the underside of the back wing that each have a unique combination of letters and numbers. You tag it, you record, where and when you tagged it, was it a male or female, etc. And you let it go, and if anybody ever finds it again, they can connect the dots. The tags weigh 6 milligrams, which is about 1% of the butterfly's weight. So I tell people it's kind of like if you're going on a long hike and you had a fanny pack. Not that big a deal. But only about 1% of the tags ever get recovered. This is from a big tagging operation they do at Creighton in New Jersey. So this is where they tagged a bunch of them, and then these are where some of those butterflies were found. So occasionally somebody will find one in their garden or something on the way to Mexico, or to some of the ones in the East Coast go to Florida instead. But most of what they find are down in the roost, and it's kind of a good news, bad news thing. You kind of, you look about this time of the year, they just published the list of recovered tags for last fall. So it's always exciting. Wow, one of our butterflies made it to Mexico, and then you say, oops, but the ones that they recover are mostly ones that died down there and fell onto the floor so people could find them. And in fact, they even, to encourage the local people to find more of them, they started paying them a little bit, like $3 a tag or something. And so human nature is the same everywhere. It's like, if you're gonna pay me $3 for a tag, I'll give you all the tags you want. They started counterfeiting them. So now they have kind of special features that make them non-fakeable. Anyway, so that's the traditional way. Now, I just found out last week something that really is horrible, which is it's now the policy of Nebraska Game and Parks that for you even to handle a butterfly or a caterpillar, a monarch, you have to have a state permit. And this is just completely unreasonable and horrible. I participate in a number of tagging programs. One of them out of Glacier Creek, and so Tracy Coleman, the person out of Glacier Creek, is trying to find out if we have a public event, is it okay just for the organizer of the event to have a tag, or does every single person that participates have to have a tag, which is obviously impossible, permit, which is obviously possible. I mean, it's totally unreasonable. There's no reason to do it. None of this stuff ever harmed monarchs. A lot of people, to increase the survival, will go out and get the eggs or the caterpillars and rear them inside so they don't die from disease or parasites or whatever, and then release them. Everybody that does that now is breaking the law in Nebraska if they don't have a permit. We need to really kind of talk to people at the state of Nebraska to say this is completely unreasonable, and it's actually going to be greatly detrimental to monarch conservation as opposed to what they think they seem to be doing. Anyway, end of sermon. But on the other hand, there's this incredibly exciting new way to track the migration, and maybe some of you know about. There's this system called MODIS. I forget what's an acronym for, but this has been going for a few years for birds. So they put up antennae all around North America, Europe, they're spreading all over the world. Kind of the antennae look like this. And then they put a solar powered radio telemetry tag on the animal. And so if it flies anywhere within a mile or so of one of these antennae, it's then picked up and recorded, downloaded into the system, it's been used for a number of years for bats and birds and things. But recently they've gotten the thing small enough that they can start putting these things on dragonflies, and last year, for the first time last fall, on monarch butterflies. So there's a guy here, Glenn Pollock, that probably a lot of you know. He's installed about 20 of these around the area. So all of the nature centers and things around here have got these things now, and it's really kind of exciting. You get on the website and kind of see this, this bird as it's migrating from Alaska to Venezuela or somewhere. Now, what's really cool about the monarch tagging is it uses Bluetooth technology. So if you have a cell phone and you download this app, you can track it. Now, it's going to be, the odds are really against you. For you to pick it up with your cell phone, it's going to have to be within about 100 yards. So the odds of one that has one of these things on it, coming with 100 yards of you is pretty slim. But on the other hand, if you have this app, you can log in and follow all the others that have been tracked. So you can kind of follow an individual. We've never been able to do that before. Follow an individual from day to day to day to day as they go down or as they come back. It's really going to be fantastic. So this is what they look like, and you just about see that one glued onto the back of the monarch. Now they're a lot bigger than the traditional tags. They're 60 milligrams instead of 6. And so they're not 1% of the butterfly's weight, they're 10%. And so they don't seem to be, preventing them from sort of getting down there and getting back. But again, that's more like having a 30-pound backpack or something as opposed to, a fanny pack. So we'll have to kind of see how that works over the years. But anyway, they have this for Android and iPhone, and it's free. So any of you could kind of download that probably not, get any fly within 100 yards of you, but you could at least track how they're doing. So this is what that looks like. This is some of the tracks of the ones that were marked farther north and went down to Mexico. And then these are some of the ones that are, have come back, that have the tags. If they fly close to one of those Modus towers, that gets them, and so that's a little bit bigger distance. But pick it up with your cell phone, it's got to be a lot closer. Again, they seem to be off to a really good start this year. So let's hope things continue. Okay, so back out of the prairie, this is what we've seen with the monarchs. So kind of like with the regals, there's no trend in terms of increasing or decreasing. There's a lot of ups and downs, like when you have a severe drought. And so there are good years and bad years, but again, the long-term average, we count, I don't know, 200 a year on average, which means there's probably, in any given year out there's probably 700 or 800. Now, they don't stick around the way the regals do. A lot of these are probably just passing through. But again, there's no evidence of any decline at Glacier Creek Reserve and a lot of other high-quality sites. I've kind of highlighted here with red. You can sort of, if you squint just right, you can sort of see the 4 generations. So these are the generation ones. This is the 1st of June again. So these are the ones coming up from Texas. And then as they reproduce and die off, then these are their progeny a month later around the 1st of July. And then their progeny a month later around the 1st of August. And then generation 4 about the 1st of August. And they're all out of here, by the end of September. And that's what we see out at the prairie. As we said, the regals, they gotta be, in grass. Monarchs like open spaces too. I mean, that's where the milkweeds grow. But we do see them, for example, they spend a lot of time in the woods on a hot summer day. They actually can't take the heat very well, which is kind of surprising. They're a tropical butterfly, but if it's 90 degrees day after day after day, it'll kill the caterpillars. And the monarchs, they also like it. So they go and hide in the trees in the shade, and they'll roost in the trees at night and so forth. So they're a little bit more of a habitat generalist than the regals, but again, they like open places because that's where the milkweeds are. This is the flowers that they go to, and again, look at what's top of the list. Out of 1,700 flower visits by monarchs at a prairie, almost half were to that. And it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much exaggeration to say in our part of the world, it's the thistles that get them to Mexico. When you get down to Texas, then it's sunflowers. But in our part of the world, by far the most important nectar plant for them are our native thistles. But again, you'll see again, common milkweed, world milkweed, butterfly weed. So again, these things are really important nectar plants. They're not just for the caterpillars. Now, what's interesting is you look at the top 12 for monarchs and the top 12 for regals, 9 of them are the same. Right? So that's what's like. Monarchs can be what's called an umbrella species. They provide cover for a lot of other things. Right? Not everybody cares about every little black sweat bee or something. But on the other hand, what you do for monarchs is probably going to be beneficial to a lot of other things too. And so they can be kind of the flagship or the umbrella. And this kind of just demonstrates that when you're doing things for monarchs, you're also going to be, doing things for regals, at least if you're at a place where there are regals, and vice versa. So this you saw before, this is the general decline. Again, the new normal is, 20% of what the old normal was. How come? Well, it's even worse if you go to California. The populations that went to roost along the coast of California were always much smaller. So when they first started counting them, in this case, they actually do physically go out and count them, because you only maybe have a few thousand in one particular, orchard or whatever. But if you go back to the 1990s, it still added up to over 1 million, which is a whole lot less than 100 million, but still, appreciable. But look, I wish they hadn't done this. This is to show it's not because they're not looking. This is how many sites they checked out. This is the number of butterflies. Look at 2020, 2025. That's 1,200,000. Last winter, 6,000. Right? That's down by more than 99.5% or something. there's a very, very real possibility that the migration to California will be gone. Partly it's because of droughts and fires and agriculture and pesticides and all the stuff they do in California. It's also partly because at least some of them, with climate change and with people planting tropical milkweeds, which are available all year round, they're not going to the roost anymore. They just continue to reproduce. So it's maybe not quite as bad as that looks, but it's still awfully bad. So what are the causes? Well, like most great disasters, there's a lot of causes. Part of it is illegal logging down in the preserves. It's an international biosphere preserve, but depending upon the government in Mexico and how strictly they enforce things or how corrupt they are, those regulations are not always kept. So this is some of the areas in 1970, and this is some of the areas 30 years later. So a lot less green, which is the intact forest. And you can also see it's much more fragmented. So it's some big blocks of continuous forest. We got just a little patch here and a little patch there. And that's bad news for the monarchs, because to be really protected, you have to be in the middle of a patch of forest rather than on the edge. This is a really busy graph from my animal behavior textbook. So, you don't have to try to figure it out. But what it basically is telling you is that if they are protected from the wind and the cold, they can survive all the way down to about 20 degrees. On the other hand, if they are exposed to the wind and the rain and the cold on the edge and not surrounded, protected by the trees, they start dying right below freezing. And so, of course, when you fragment the forest, nobody's in the middle of a big patch of forest anymore. Everybody's on an edge. And they do get, every decade or so, they do actually get severe winter storms in the area of the roost. They get ice storms, they get snowstorms. And when it happens, there have been as many as a third of them or more that froze to death and died. And with this exposure, when a storm comes along, the mortality is a lot heavier than it used to be. So this is from, I think, 2016 or something. All the dead monarchs, covered, on the ground down there in Mexico. I keep tripping over that. Second major reason is American agriculture. Again, generations 2, 3, and 4 are all produced here in the United States. And in the last 25 years or so, we've lost an amount of habitat equivalent to the size of the state of Texas in terms of habitat with milkweeds that they can grow on. Why is this? Well, two main reasons. First of all, ethanol. There's an ethanol mandate that says a certain amount of the fuel has to be containing ethanol. And of course, ethanol producers are extremely, influential politically. Right? So a lot of extra ground has been planted to corn and taken out of natural areas and corn. We grow more corn now than we have in a century, in this country. But the other thing, so in addition to taking grassland out of habitat and growing corn on it, is that the corn now is almost entirely genetically engineered corn, which is tolerant to the herbicide glyphosate or Roundup. And so you now have a nice, beautiful, clean cornfield because you can then spray the whole thing with Roundup, and you kill every plant except the corn, or every plant except the soybeans or the cotton or whatever. These genetically engineered Roundup-ready crops now are overwhelmingly what farmers are able to get for corn and beans and things. And so why does that matter? Well, it matters because a lot of the monarchs were growing up in a cornfield or around the edge of a cornfield. So again, here's a nice milkweed kind of growing in the cornfield, kind of a schematic diagram. In Iowa, 53% of milkweed was growing in an agricultural field. As recently as 2000 before, Roundup-ready crops. So again, if you add that all up, it's a habitat loss, equal to the size of the state of Texas. Not only was it milkweed, but it was the very best milkweed. Right? It was fertilized. It was irrigated. The studies that they've done there at Iowa State show that proportionately, you rear 4 times as many monarchs from a milkweed in a cornfield as you do from a milkweed in a tallgrass prairie, right? Because it's nurtured and pampered. Okay, but it's all gone now. So now we're never getting the cornfields back. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. That's gone. And there's other habitat loss too. Again, we talked about the expansion of agriculture areas for things like ethanol, but also roads, urban areas and so forth. So a lot of habitat is lost for other reasons too. Now, that especially matters because the heartland of the monarch butterflies in North America is exactly the same as the corn belt. Right? This is the corn belt, right? This is where they grow all the corn and beans, and this is where half of the monarchs are reared. I mean, that overlap is perfect, right? And so not only are we eliminating all the habitat, we were eliminating the habitat from which most of them, came. Pesticides, they haven't really looked at the effect of pesticides on monarchs the same way they have on bees, but there's no reason to think that they're not just as devastating to butterflies as they are to bees, especially these things called neonicotinoids. So I don't expect you to read that. That's just the thing from the Xerces Society showing you kind of all the ways that the neonicotinoids affect bee populations. The same thing with butterflies. There's also mosquito spraying, and then just people, spraying in their own backyards. So what's interesting about this, in a kind of nefarious way, is the largest merger in the history of the world took place about 10 years ago. The herbicide was made by Monsanto, and the neonicotinoids were made by Bayer, the German company. And about 10 years ago, Bayer bought Monsanto. So Bayer controls the whole thing now. They make the neonicotinoids, and all of the corn and bean seeds are coated with neonicotinoid insecticides to keep things from like rootworms from eating the little seedling. So Bayer now makes the insecticide that you coat the seeds with and you can spray the crop with, and they make the Roundup that you can use to kill the weeds in your field. So Bayer has really got a stranglehold on American farmers. Okay, so remember back at the prairie though, we didn't see declines. So that's kind of interesting. So a bunch of people at Cornell have said, well, yeah, we realize that what's going on in Mexico doesn't help, and what's going on in American agriculture doesn't help. But they say, if you look at a place like Glacier Creek and lots of other places, we don't see that decline the way that we see it down in Mexico. So they have put forth a kind of a little bit of a radical different idea, which is we're raising them, they're just not making it to Mexico. Why wouldn't they make it to Mexico? Well, a lot of them get a protozoan disease, which kind of cripples them. For a couple of reasons that I can talk about in the questions, but I won't talk about now. The rates of infection with this disease are going up. Again, it was just part of the natural sort of cycle, that maybe 10% of them would get infected every year, but there are places now where it's much, much higher than that. They're not in a state where they could fly to Mexico. A really important thing is fall flowers. Monarchs are not like birds. Birds fatten up before they migrate. Some birds double their weight before they take off. Monarchs don't do that. Monarchs, as they fly that 2,000 miles or so, they visit the flowers to get the fuel to keep them going, but they also build up their fat reserves so that they can arrive in Mexico with the fat reserves. They fatten up as they go. So the fall flowers are really critical. And so if we have droughts or changes in agriculture or whatever, and those fall flowers, things like thistles in Nebraska and sunflowers in Mexico aren't there, they're not going to make it to Mexico, or if they do, they're not going to make it through the winter. And then, a lot of them get hit on the roads, especially when they get down to Mexico. They kind of funnel into a very narrow bottleneck as they go from Texas into Mexico. So there have been a number of studies that show a lot of monarchs get hit because they're going south and the roads go east and west. And so they get hit. These are just kind of some different data, but there's a real bottleneck down here as they go from Texas into Mexico. There's a couple of major Mexican interstates that run east-west right in that area. And literally millions of monarchs get killed on the Mexican highway. They put up signs saying like, slow down for the butterflies, but you know, people are people everywhere. Nobody slows down for the butterflies. Inclement weather is a big factor. You know, the two most important things, you know, given everything else, the two most important things for how many monarchs we're going to have in any given year are the spring weather in Texas and the summer weather in the Midwest. You know, so if you have droughts or something like that, then you know, that's going to be a bad year for monarchs. Then mowing of roadsides and right-of-ways eliminates that much habitat, or its habitat you can convert to natural habitat by, you know, having kind of natural areas on right-of-ways and roads, and weed ordinances. So this is the drought map for Nebraska right now. And this is from the existing, you know, City of Omaha weed ordinance, right? It shall be the duty of each owner, agent, occupant, or person in possession, charge, or control of any lot of ground or any lot in the city to cut and clear such lot or ground together with 1/2 of the right-of-way, streets and alleys abutting thereon of all weeds, grass, and nuisance vegetation which have reached the height of 12 inches or more. Such weeds, grass, and nuisance vegetation shall be cut as close to the ground level as possible and shall be maintained so that at no time does it extend 12 inches above the ground. The cutting shall be raked and removed. This is not an ancient thing. This was like June of 24 was the last update of this. Now, a lot of the things that they consider nuisance are caterpillar plants and nectar plants, right? Like verbena, right, is a nuisance plant, right? You know, our native vervains. Anyway, so there's a big movement around the country by people that care about things like monarchs. Change the darn weed ordinances. And I've been written up twice, you know, for having things in my yard that, you know, were things like New England aster, you know, and milkweed, you know, and things you would think, you know, they would understand, you know, are not really a nuisance and certainly not noxious. But anyway, that's one of the other, you know, problems we run into in urban areas. And then there's the long-term threat looming over everybody, climate change. There have been a couple of studies, you know, simulations, and they've all come to the same conclusion that 50 years from now, those places that go in Mexico now will be suitable anymore. Again, there would be a greatly increased number of these severe winter storms. They won't be able to make it there. But we don't know whether they can go anywhere else. You know, if it's all pre-programmed instinct, they may not have the flexibility to go somewhere farther north where the conditions would be favorable then. So, you know, who knows what the situation is going to be, you know, 30, 40 years down the road with respect to the ones going to Mexico. So how can you help? Well, again, unlike the Regals, where, you know, you can't do a lot yourself, there is a lot you can do yourself for monarchs. You know, even a backyard with nectar plants and milkweed could raise a lot of monarchs and could really help. So the first thing is to provide the caterpillar host plant, which are milkweeds. These are our 4 common milkweeds around here. Common is what 90% of them grow up on because there's so much of it. Swamp milkweed is what they prefer to lay their eggs on if it's available. There's also, of course, butterfly weed, which isn't really a very good caterpillar plant, but it's a really good nectar plant. And then out of the prairies, you get this thing called world milkweed. Anyway, so these are all things that you could have in your garden that would raise caterpillars, and especially common milkweed and swamp milkweed would be really good things to get. A lot of people, you know, what about tropical milkweed, Mexican milkweed, which a lot of people now put in their gardens. In our part of the world, it's fine because you have to treat it like an annual. It will not survive the winter. The problem is if you have milkweed that's available all year round, which would be the case with this thing in the south. All of our native milkweeds die back to the ground in the winter. And so they don't tempt butterflies to stop migrating and reproduce instead, but also they don't build up over time, more and more populations of those spores. But if you have milkweed available all year in, you know, the Southeast or in Southern California, whatever, again, it can divert them from migrating, but even worse, it can build up big populations of that protozoan parasite, and, you know, they just die. So if you're in Texas or Florida or California, you should never, ever, you know, put tropical milkweed in your yard. In our part of the world, it's okay because they're not going to survive the winter here, and they are. The butterflies love them, you know, in terms of laying eggs on. They're much more poisonous than the ones that we have here. So don't let your kids or dogs eat them, because they're much more toxic than the native ones that we have here. Second thing, you got nectar plants for the adults. So you want to have something blooming. The monarchs are here from Memorial Day through Labor Day. You got to have something flowering all the time for them. Of course, for the other pollinators too. Large blocks of particular colors are good. The more kind of a block of color, the more attractive they are. Monarchs also love sunny spots. They like some of the annuals, zinnias, verbenas, marigolds, are things that they will go to. There's a lot of perennial flowers and shrubs that are good for them. Butterfly bush is considered a noxious plant in some parts of the country because it can be invasive, but that's not a problem here. If they even survive the winter, you're lucky. But anyway, butterfly bush, Joe pine weed, sunflowers, coneflowers, blazing stars, phlox, goldenrods, bead moths, thistles, asters, and many others. So they're not particularly fussy about what they will go to get nectar from. Although if you give them a thistle, they'll go there first. This is from 10 years or so, my front yard. New England aster doing crazy in September. There are 7 migrating monarchs and 1 migrating buckeye, that are fueling up on that, New England aster, on their way south. So you can have this kind of thing in your yard. In fact, all summer with the 4 generations. Again, milkweeds, just a couple of are wonderful nectar plants. They're not just for the caterpillars. They're nectar plants. All kinds of bees and flies and butterflies and things like to go and get milkweed nectar. You should try to use natives rather than cultivated ornamental varieties. They support much more wildlife than do the things you buy, from your kind of traditional garden shop. A lot of people like bee balm, but we have a native Bernarda, wild bergamot, which to me is just as attractive and is one of our very best nectar plants. So why get this when you can get that? Doug Town has written a number of books. I really recommend them all. But his first one was called Bringing Nature Home, and it really just goes into the tremendously increased benefits that you get from using natives as opposed to kind of your traditional horticultural varieties. Again, these are the top monarchs in the monarch flowers in the prairies. Again, just to repeat what you already saw. So again, most of these things now can be obtained from was it Nebraska native plants or from Prairie Moon Nursery or from various sources and seeds, or get the the plants or whatever. So it's much more possible now. Still not easy, but it's much more possible now to get natives than it used to be. And again, there were like organizations that like Nebraska Monarchs that have plant giveaways coming up here in less than a month. That you can sign up for and get some of these native plants for your garden. Check that out. Go to Nebraska Monarchs website and check out the details about time and place and so on. Again, some of the native wildflowers that we talked about. Go easy on chemicals. Again, studies have shown that people use pesticides in their own yards at 3 times the rate that farmers put pesticides on their crops. So again, go pesticide free. Try to buy plants that aren't pre-treated with pesticides. Because people would go to the garden store and they want to put the plants in their yard and they're kind of nice and beautiful and clean. They don't have holes in them where something's been eating them. So they pre-treat them with pesticides. So the monarch comes and lands on it and dies from the neonicotinoids. So try to be sure that you're getting plants that haven't been pre-treated. Some outfits are now saying that they don't do that anymore. Lowe's claims that they don't, but actually people have gone in and sampled some of the plants at Lowe's, and they did actually have insecticides. So again, you won't just be helping monarchs. You're going to be helping a lot of the other beneficials too, the other pollinators and all the other beneficials, which are the predators and parasites of the real insect pests. So you want to kind of create as close as you can to like an actual ecosystem, in your yard, and you will get a tremendous amount of enjoyment. You'll be not only helping the pollinators, butterflies and bees and things, you'll be providing food for birds. Most birds raise their young on caterpillars, and you'll be rearing a lot of natural enemies of the true insect pests. And the last thing you can do is just support the appropriate organizations. So places like the Xerces Society, Monarch Watch down at KU, the Nature Conservancy, Game and Parks, Nebraska Monarchs, Nebraska Native Plant Society. There's lots and lots of organizations that are kind of involved in the effort. Participate in citizen science, get involved in the tagging programs if you're legally allowed to do it anymore. Again, they have monarch surveys, the Game and Parks does, just like they do Regal surveys. The lobby, be politically active. Lobby your local governments, the state governments, change their roadside mowing practices, change their weed ordinances, kind of do things that would be beneficial. And you can even do things like ecotourism. I mean, go down to Mexico and support the local people. The whole idea of some of the conservation plans is like, we want to make the trees more valuable to the local people with butterflies in them than they are if you cut them down, for lumber. And so you can do things maybe that can kind of help in that way in terms of, I've never been there, it's on my bucket list, but 10,000 feet up, I don't know how well I would do, airwise at 10,000 feet up, but anyway. So that's my presentation, and I'm sorry I ran a little long here. But there's just so much to talk about, and if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to take them either here or in the chat. And thank you all for coming, and thank Nebraska, Conservation Nebraska for the invitation. Yes, sir.
You said that the fritillary population in Kansas was not as threatened.
Well, I mean, I grew up down 200 miles south of here, on the edge of the Flint Hills. And so they're even a glacier reserve, they're one of the 10 most common butterflies. But yeah, they are considered to be in good shape. There's really only 2 patches of extensive prairie left in North America now, which is the Sandhills, of course, and then the Flint Hills down in Kansas. Of course, you couldn't farm the Sandhills because it was all sand. And you can't farm the Flint Hills because it's all rock. And so they graze on it. They burn it every year, to provide fresh grass for the cattle. But it seems that, those grasslands in eastern Kansas are really the last of the really strong strongholds for the Regals. Yeah.
How does one get one of those permits?
Well, you have to, you go to the Game and Parks website. They've always issued permits for all kinds of things. Like Tracy Coleman at the preserve studies snakes, and so she catches them, and she actually has a bunch of them with radio transmitters. Tracks some snakes around the preserve and stuff. So she said what she told me was that just go to the Game and Parks website. She said to fill in the form takes 10 minutes, to hear back from them takes 3 months. So. Bureaucracy, and you can just imagine how many hundreds of people are going to be asking for a monarch permit. It's just, the whole thing is insane. It's completely misguided in terms of how can we help the species? Well, sometimes by protecting it too much, you're actually causing more harm. California did this last year. I think other states like Nebraska are just copying what California did.
When are they most active during the day?
Monarchs both. I mean, butterflies are sun lovers. And so they will wait in the morning until it gets nice and warm and the dew kind of evaporates off and so forth. And then they're really most active in the middle of the day. We do our surveys, we try to hit about 11 o'clock. Our surveys take a couple hours, so we try to hit them around 11 o'clock. Then when it gets really hot in the afternoon, maybe they'll kind of go and see cover stuff. But the middle of the day is the peak time. Some of you are old enough to remember the old vaudeville song, Mad Dogs and Englishmen Come Out in the Midday Sun. Anybody ever heard that, Noel Coward? So I say, Mad Dogs, Englishmen, and butterflies come out in the midday sun.
Kind of on that note, I've done some other citizen science projects for different species, and it has to be a specific amount of wind, temperature, all
and that's true. I mean, when we do our surveys, it has to be, it can be a low to moderate wind, but not extremely windy. It can't be obviously rainy. The weather affects them less than I thought it would. But the Regals are, kind of an exception to that. They not only do they have to be in a prairie, but the sun has to be coming out. Sun has to be out. A passing cloud will come over and block the sun. They will all land until the cloud moves away, and then they start flying again. So they're incredibly finicky about the sun being out. Some of our other butterflies, the sulfurs, which are our commonest butterflies, are really sensitive to wind. They don't like to fly when it's windy. Monarchs are tough, you know, unless it gets to be 98 degrees, they're not slowing down for anything. Yeah.
We're talking about butterfly bush and you've got a question up on your chat about it and
Oh, okay.
any
Yeah, I didn't look
Facebook
at
group
the chat.
I've ever been in with about butterfly planting,
No,
you have
they're-
your head right now.
That's you know, that's not going to be the case. You know, a female that's got eggs is going to be looking for she's going to be looking for milkweed. I mean, they will go to that to get nectar, and they would go to other things to get nectar. But it's not going to distract them from egg laying any more than any other nectar plant.
People like
When
it,
they've got-
it's
when
just
they've got
eating
an
trash
ovary-
food.
When they've got an ovary full of 100 eggs that they need to lay, that's, you know, top priority. Yeah, so that's not, now again, in some parts of the country, they're considered invasive. So you wouldn't want to grow them in you know, Oregon or someplace like that. But in our part of the world, again, what they don't do is they're not a host plant. They're not native. They don't support a lot of native insects. You know, we don't have a bunch of caterpillars that eat them and things like that. So in terms of that idea of creating kind of a natural ecosystem in their yard, all they're doing is providing some nectar. But butterflies love to go and get nectar from them, not just monarchs, but lots of things. So I don't have anything against butterfly bush in our part of the world. Do they live in the sand? Yes. I don't know about a yucca flowering. That's a good question. They are flying around at about the time the yuccas are out. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. You know, regals aren't poisonous, and so you know anything that might eat a big insect, you know, could eat a regal. Most things learn to leave monarchs alone. You know, one bad experience with a monarch is usually enough to say don't eat anything that's bright, you know, red anymore. In fact, it's kind of funny, but our common milkweed is very, very low in toxin. It's almost toxin free, and that's what 90% of them grow up on. But you know, the ones that come here from Texas all grew up on poisonous things in Texas. So, you know, you're a young blue jay eating your first butterfly, right? It's likely to be one of those really nasty things from Texas and not one of the later things from up here. You know, so a guy who studied monarchs for many years, Lincoln Brower, called it auto-mimicry. It's kind of like the later generation of monarchs are kind of benefiting by mimicking the early generations of monarchs, which have trained the birds not to eat a monarch. Yeah, any other questions on chat? Okay.
Right now.
Yeah, good. Oh yeah, see, this is what we talked about last week. There was a monarch. You know, this is very unusual. You know, to have the ones that went all the way, the winds that came through in September and spent the winter in Mexico, they don't normally come back. You know, and so that's you know, it's very unusual for this many to be coming this far north. And this is the problem we talked about, that there's just not much milkweed out there. They normally wouldn't lay more than one egg on a milkweed stem.
Mine's only that tall.
But yeah, it's just only the last week or two they've come out, and so they're probably just desperate. You know, when they find some milkweed, they're probably getting rid of a lot more eggs than they can. They're not all going to make it. They're going to, a caterpillar as it grows eats a lot of milkweed leaves, and so even one milkweed stem probably can support more than a caterpillar or two. It's iffy again because they're all kind of competing. It's kind of the odds are against all of them. You know, making it all the way through. It's just they're out of whack, and I don't know whether this is climate change or whether it's just a lot of south winds this year in Texas or whatever. But you know, this is not a good trend. I mean, it's nice to see monarchs in April, but monarchs need milkweed. You know, and we see this with a lot of species. Like birds are now out of sync with when the caterpillars come out. You know, the caterpillars come out when it's hot. The birds come back from the tropics the time they've always come back from the tropics. Well, now when they come back from the tropics, the caterpillars are all gone. So because of climate change, things are getting out of whack. And this hopefully isn't a trend. But yeah, I wouldn't be real optimistic about that. If this might be, if it were legal, this might be one of those situations where you might want to collect some of those eggs and put them on some other milkweed that doesn't have eggs on it. But on any given milkweed plant, that's probably too many for them to make. Sorry, I wish I'd be more optimistic, but they eat a lot of milkweed.
That's our extension entomologist.
Oh, Jody, no, there you go. I didn't notice that. Hi, Jody. I didn't realize that was you. Yeah. Jody's great.
Yeah.
You know, I know if you see her on Thursday, see her on Thursdays on Backyard Farmer. We have an insect, anybody that might be interested. We have an insect club at Hitchcock Nature Center that meets like the fourth Thursday of every month in the summer. And Jody's doing the first presentation here in May. So if you're really interested really into bugs, kind of check out, you can contact me and check out the Hitchcock Nature Center Insect Club. Sorry, I should have looked at who it was. Sorry, Jody. That was a great question though, yeah. Yeah.
Do the the fritillaries respond well to like reintroduction efforts, like in, you know, when prairies are restored, but the population is actually
well, there's two things they need. One of them are the violets. And, you know, if you're, you know, mowing, you're not going to affect the violets. They're right down on the ground there. So, you know, fires, you know, fires don't necessarily burn everything. You know, they can be kind of spotty, but in general, you know, a fire is going to really wipe them out. Mowing probably won't affect them much at all in terms of the caterpillars. As long as, you know, 2 months later, there are flowers for them to feed on.
What about from like site to site? Like if a population was totally gone, have people tried to like collect eggs and reintroduce them to restore?
Yeah, that's, I'm guessing that that's probably not allowed anymore now either. You know, we did 20 years ago, we did what's called a mark release recapture study, where you catch a bunch of them, what we did in those days, pretty low tech, you actually took a Sharpie pen and like wrote a number on their wing. You know, the scales absorb the ink quite well. Now they say that that's probably not the best thing for them. But anyway, you can put a tag on them. But anyway, and so let's say you go out and you catch 100 and you put tags on them and you come back, you know, a week later and you catch another 100 and half of them have tags. Say, aha, half of this 100 had tags. You know, so that means there are twice as many out there, you know, as we caught this time. So this is kind of a standard way that they do, you know, populations, you know, get populations for animals. It's a mark, release, recapture, and then use the proportions to kind of extrapolate. And so that's how the year that we did this was way back in the, you know, the first decades of this century. It wouldn't be legal now without a permit from, you know, game and parks. And that you know, that might be worth it to do. But what we found was that was where I said that there were 3 or 4 out there for everyone that we count. That was based on the estimate that we got from that mark recapture study. So the thing about these transects is they don't tell you how many there are. They tell you how are they compared to last year or you know, last month. But you don't know what the actual number was. It's just like more or less or the same. And so you have to do something like a mark recapture study to actually get the number of them. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming out and this recording is available for them if they, for them to listen to or to get information from. But also, I made a PDF of this PowerPoint. So if you just contact me, tedburk@creighton.edu, I'd be happy to send you the PDF if you want kind of some of the more specific information or whatever.